What is the most interesting story you have of an ancestor, past your parents' generation? My grandfather was posted as missing in action. Believed killed. WWI. My grandmother was expecting their first child. That usually meant they were actually killed, so grandmother was certain that she would never see him again. Then there was a knock at the door and grandfather was standing there in the hospital blue uniform. Soldiers wore to show they were receiving treatment. He had been knocked unconscious by the explosion everyone thought killed him and sent to a hospital close to his home without being identified. When he came around and was otherwise unhurt, they gave leave to go home before being sent back to the front. Grandmother went into slightly early labor caused by the shock. Granddad survived the war. My grandmother and the baby were both okay and all lived quite long and healthy lives. My great-great etc grandfather was the first convict sent to Australia to be freed after serving his time. He went on to develop the wheat that we grow here. European wheat died. Close bracket. That's very cool. Do you know why he was sent there? My grandfather's grandfather was found wandering naked in a forest. He was estimated to be around 8 or 9 years old. He didn't speak, but understood when spoken to. After a few years he started talking, but was never able to recall anything about his life before he was found by the family that took him in. My great-great-great grandparents. They raised him as their own and all the stories say he turned out pretty normal. So you come from a line of yet unidentified heritage? That's cool man, real mysterious. My great-grandfather came home early from work one day to find his wife in bed with the milkman or mailman. I can't remember. Either way, there was a scuffle and the milk/mailman went out the bedroom window and died 2 days later in the hospital. This happened in the same house that I grew up in because the house was in my family for a very long time. I tried looking up news articles and such on the incident, but was never able to find anything. This was a common discussion at parties with my family and I always tried to learn more about my great-grandfather. Turns out he was an undertaker. Go figure. Did your grandparent look like the milkman? My great-great-grandmother was Winston Churchill's parlour maid. When she left service to get married, he begged her to stay as he was fond of her, and when she said no, he gifted her a table and chair from his own parlour as a wedding gift. My parents have the chair in my mum's office, and the table is currently in storage. Edit. Wrong number of greats lol. You need to take them onto Antiques Roadshow the next time they are somewhere near you. I would love to see that when I'm watching. I'll do the Leo meme pointing at the TV. Dutch here. My maternal grandfather was part of a group of people that hid Jews and allies in a hidden village, underground house, made in the woods during World War II. They were later discovered by the SS, but they still managed to save a lot of people. To this day you can visit the remains of the hidden village to see what it was like. I've been to the Netherlands only once and really want to go back. I would love to see this. Where is it located? Is it a museum? My great-grandpa once got his hands on 10 kilograms of tobacco because a smuggler threw it away while being chased by the border guards. My grandmother and my uncles once got several cases of Canadian whiskey during the Prohibition. Smugglers threw it overboard from a speedboat which was being chased by a revenue cutter through the bay at night. Come morning the tide went out, which reveled a bunch of wooden crates out on the flats. They all ran out and recovered them. My grandfather, born in 1889, grew up on a farm. One day he and his brother were digging out a tree stump using mattocks, each one swinging alternately from the opposite side. His brother mistimed a downswing and clocked my grandfather on the head. His father put some kind of liniment on the wound and put him to bed. When my grandfather woke up the next morning, he was blind. His father thought he was faking it to get out of doing his chores and told him to get to work. My grandfather felt his way out to the barn and fed the sheep, and by then his father realized he was telling the truth. His sight returned in a few days. My grandfather went on to become a doctor and realized that the blow from the mattock had damaged the optic nerve, fortunately, not permanently. He served as an army doctor in France during World War I, when he also had to deal with the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. My great-grandfather grew up super poor in Italy. He had an infection of some sort in his arm that would kill him if untreated, and because he was poor, it was left untreated. So one day, at age 14, he and a few friends found a bottle of liquor, a tree stump, and an axe. The only pictures I've seen of him, he only has one arm. How much of his arm was taken off? My grandma, mother's side, was abandoned in an orphanage by my great-grandmother because she wanted to run off and marry another man, and he would not take her children. So my great-grandfather, who was in the army during WW1, came to see them and promised to come back after the next battle. It was the Somme. He died. The same grandmother did not know how old she was. By the time she obtained a copy of her birth certificate later in life, she found out she was a year older than she thought she was. My dad's grandfather was an advertising artist, semi-famous at the time. There is an original of his passed down in our family. It is with my dad's oldest brother now. It is of a boy running down a famous road in my northern city past a famous theater still being used to this day. When my grandmother died, we found out that she'd been married before my grandfather and had 4 children. When she and that husband split up, they just dumped all the kids in an orphanage and bounced. My dad was in his 60s when he found out he had 4 siblings he'd never known about. It was quite a blow for him, obviously. Che Guevara taught my grandfather to play chess. His father used to get into bar fights with Pancho Villa, and my family's last name exists because 2 Scottish brothers got drunk, stole a cannon from the local militia armory, and accidentally shot the steeple off the local church while hauling her out of Scotland. They told their kids, if anyone asks who you are, just say you're German and pretend you don't know English. They didn't know German either. I have to that are somehow connected. My great grandfather, during WW2, lived through some wild shit. He was sent to Gulag and escaped from the transport somewhere in today's Belarus. He then returned home on foot to the middle of northern Poland, where we live today. If you want more exact location, Google where my town, Atkzu, is. After few years, in middle of which my grandpa was born, he was taken to serve in German army. He was based somewhere in Norway and escaped once again, but not before he blew up the warehouse with weapons he was kinda in charge of. On a lighter, funny AF note, he was one of 13 children. His mother, my great-great-grandmother, named her second child Stanislaw and named her last child Stanislaw. She had so many children that she forgot she already used that name. Lol. The second Stanislaw sadly didn't live through infancy. During the partition of India in 1947, my grandmother and her family, Sikh, lived in a village with Hindus, Sikhs and one Muslim family. During the brutality of it all, people in the village wanted to attack the Muslim family, but my great-grandfather intervened and stopped them from being hurt. He then helped them leave the village to make their way to Pakistan from the Indian side of the Punjab, where my grandmother's village was. We still do not know to this day what happened to the Muslim family and whether they survived. One of my great-grandmother climbed on top of Mount Blanc in 1942 during the German occupation of France. On top of that, she did it while wearing a dress. We have pictures of it in my family. Go on, show us a pic or two, please. Mountain goat pushed my great-great-uncle off a cliff, and that's how someone got the idea for Goat Simulator. My grandmother's grandmother walked the Trail of Tears. Her parents did not make the walk, assumed dead. When she reached Oklahoma, she was adopted by a white couple. She was put down as half Cherokee, half white on the roll because of this. We attended a performance of a play about the Trail of Tears in Cherokee, NC. It's a devastating story. A Georgia soldier later said, I fought through the war between the states and have seen many men shot, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I never knew. Apostrophe. My grandfather during WW2. He was born in 1908, so lived through both WW, and since we live in Moselle, northeast of France, he lived in occupied territory from the beginning every time, and spoke perfect German. He was a mechanic, so when Germany invaded the second time he was put to work fixing vehicles, except he pretended to not understand a single word of German. The soldiers always took so long explaining him what needed to be done. He would mess up, Whatever could be an honest mistake without being in too much danger. The commander hated him for all of this, but needed the skills, since he was good. At the end of the war, when they received the orders to retreat, my grandfather gave them a farewell speech in the best, most well-spoken German possible, basically saying fuck you, goodbye. The second in command was so furious about being made a fool all this time, reached for his gun, but was stopped by his chief because it was not worth it and they were running out of time. My grandpa beat Rod Laver in a tennis match when he was a teenager and was going to be sponsored by Dunlop, but his parents were wealthy and thought tennis was silly with little money at the time, so he didn't pursue it. Now there's a stadium named after Rod Laver. One of my great-grandmother's grandma was an aristocrat. She fell in love with a peasant boy working on their lands. Her father told her he would disown her if she wanted to be with that boy. So one dark night the boy got my grandma escaped from their home, and they ran away. Needless to say she was disowned. And that's the story of why I have to work now, instead of just seeing my monthly allowance to show up on my bank account. Omnia vincit American Englisher. Farm boy, fetch me that picture as you wish. Great grandpa Andrew threw rocks through his landlord's windows in Cork, jumped onto the next ship to Canada, started a farm on the Etowah River, changed his surname to MacDonald so people would think he was Scottish, and imprisoned the tax collector in his cellar when they came to demand land taxes from him. What? Great-granddad was a Jewish shop owner in Italy in the 1930s. One day a fascist march turns into a lynch mob chasing a communist. The communist slips away, finds my family's shop, and begs for shelter because Jews are known commie sympathizers. But a gun-wielding fascist comes to the store looking for him because he knew it was owned by Jews and Jews are known commie sympathizers. My great-granddad denies hiding the commie, but the fascist says if they don't bring him out immediately he'll shoot my great-granddad. So great-granddad snatches the gun and kills the fascist on the spot. He got acquitted for self-defense, but they had to escape Italy 24 hours after the acquittal. The fascist party graciously sent a notice allowing them 24 hours to leave before they killed all the men of the family. If you trace my family line back far enough you get to Norwegian royalty. Second son of a third son, kind of thing. My mom and my stepdad share an ancestor about 4 generations back. Also somewhere in this range my great-ex-grandma received a letter from her brother that had left Austria. He said come to America, if not for your sake, then for your children's sake. She talked her husband into it, they moved to the Midwest, and several generations later I was born. I have an ancestor who, in Victorian England, spent time in an asylum for the criminally insane for having stolen diamond jewelry from his employer. My great-grandfather killed my great-grandmother's sweeter and kidnapped her a night before her wedding. Oh my god. For real? My grandfather came from a small town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and had rarely left the state when he volunteered to fight in WW2. Pretty soon he was on a plane to Midway from Pearl. He's sitting next to a man he doesn't know for an hour before the co-pilot comes back and asks the man next to him, Admiral Lindbergh, would you like to fly the plane? At that time Charles Lindbergh was possibly the most famous man on earth. It is on brand for my grandpa to be fairly unimpressed by him. This is pretty neat. I live a couple miles from the home he was raised in. It's now a MN State Park. The woman who adopted my mother is part of the Vavaza family, an ancient Norman family dating back to the time of William the Conqueror. Also found out my great-grandfather on my mother's side was a serial bigamist. The more you know. My great-uncle on my father's side took a grenade to the face during the World War, horrific injury, and ended up homeless on the streets. Funnily enough the same streets I was homeless on a few years back, but I didn't know at the time. My life is very unusual. Maybe I should write a book. The uncle of my grandfather was part of Hitler's personal SS Corps. I have a friend whose uncle of a grandfather was a bodyguard of Hermann Göring. He lost both his legs after he messed up and was sent to the Russian front as punishment, but still praised Hitler and the Nazis until he died. I also have an SS grandfather who dug up human remains at the Swiss border in 1941. General advice here, Don't ask your German friends about their family history. You're gonna have a bad time. One of my ancestors was Curly Bill Brocious, the leader of the infamous Cowboys gang which fought against the Earps in and around Tombstone, Arizona in the 1870s/80s. He was killed by Wyatt Earp himself by a shotgun blast that reportedly tore him in two.